Professor Fabbri, I'm very glad to be here with you in SemioLab of Aristotle University of Thessaloniki. I would like first to thank you for accepting our invitation to address a keynote speech in our Congress and to give an interview to Aristotle University SemioLab. It's a great honor and pleasure to have you in Greece, in Thessaloniki.
Thank you.
I will start our conversation with my first question. What is your impression of semiotics in Greece? Do you have any recommendations for our students?
Yes, a lot of recommendations. Just one. The idea that you have not to take the semiotics as a sort of set of instruction for applying theory to reality, but to use the application of semiotics as a problem, create new ideas, a new method for semiotics. When you describe a text, you have a social text, certainly, not just a text in the normal sense of the definition. You have to, in the same time, to discover something, because if you have nothing new to discover, you have not interesting to make an application. But in the same time, every application had to interrogate the meta-language you use. Out of the text you apply, you have to say, well, I will modify the concept I use. My view for the future of the new generation, that will be a good solution, a good suggestion. No application, but discovering in the text itself the organization, the social organization, the meaning organization, and at the same time, the way in which you have to interrogate your models and modify and transform the models.
Thank you. The International Conference on Science of Europe have just finished at Aristotle University of Thessaloniki. What are your overall impressions for our Congress?
I attend a part of the Congress, not all the Congress. Well, in my view, there are very different levels of knowledge and competence. I say competence in the Chomskyan sense, the knowledge of the lexicon and the knowledge of rules. Well, there is a great difference in competence, and it's necessary to homologate this difference. People speak about, I don't give an example, trope, metaphor, narrative forms, logical inferences. The problem is how they are related to each other. And there are moments in which you speak about narrative and you speak about logical inferences, abduction and so on, but how you can show that sometimes narrative is a form of logical transformation of content. You use narrative because you transform meaning, not just to represent meaning. And when you speak about tropes, generally people spoken about tropes as a generalization, metaphors. I heard a lot of narrative and a lot of metaphors. Why metaphors? Jakobson said that the restricted way of Roman Jakobson, sure. Roman Jakobson said the restricted definition of rhetoric is at least metaphor and metonymy, but is a very short definition of tropes. There are more than that. I will give you an example. In the Chinese traditional culture, the classical culture, in a big literature, a great literature, the Chinese poetry they don't use metaphors. There are very few metaphors. But there is another figure which is very dominant is allusion. Allusion is very interesting because it's not a problem of metaphor in which you cross from one term to another term. The idea of allusion, and you pass from a man and you charge another man to make men in all the sense of the terms, actors, and you say, for the interpretation of what you said. You said something, but the other one take the responsibility of the meaning in the allusions. At the same time, it's a great responsibility, because sometimes if you believe that you have heard and understand the allusion, sometimes you are wrong. And there is another problem in allusion, is the secret. It's not a communication, it's an invitation to analyze and discover the secret, what is implicit in your discourse. In my view, we have to enlarge the domain of rhetorics. Certainly, rhetorics is an enormous quantity of figures, and unfortunately, they are related generally to a theory of language, lexicon, grammar, and so on. But Saussure said that we have to integrate to the knowledge of linguistics also the rhetorical figure. I think that is important. People, I don't know, but I heard constantly the problem of metaphor. But problem of metaphor is just a very limited part of rhetorics, and also is important for our Occidental culture. There are cultures in which metaphors are not so important.
Yes, thank you. What are your thoughts on the session on images, sound, and narratives of Europe?
It was very interesting in my view, and what I heard was really interesting. The analysis made by sociologists, because they are mainly sociologists, were very interesting. But my opinion, they lack of history of art competence. Not in the sense of because there is a tradition, a history of art. Sure, in the representation you have a lot, Europa and the bull and so on and so on. But the way in which history of art contributes in fundamental concept of semiotic of images, and I think that will be very interesting to integrate this concept. For example, yes. I was very interested to the idea that you have a €2 coin representing Europa and the bull, with a minimum artistic knowledge. Is very easy to make an analysis which is deeper than the superficial analysis. It's funny to say that there is the only representation of Europa and the bull in a coin, in European coin, is in Greece.
You are right, yes. What are your thoughts on the session on EU symbolic discourses and practices?
This is a great question, because it's the problem of the relationship between symbols and signs. Symbols and signs are not synonyms. In the first beginning of his work, Ferdinand de Saussure used symbol and sign as synonyms. Is exactly what Cassirer do. But I think that now we have the possibility to make a distinction, and the distinction can increase the knowledge and the intelligibility of what is a symbol and what is a sign. There is the distinction made by, I don't know, Lacan or Saussure. We have the real, the imaginary, and the symbolic. Or you have the distinction of Peirce, the index, the icons, and the symbols. Yeah. Eco wrote an interesting text, a very interesting text, in which he tried to, a beautiful article in which he explained that symbols is too much. because in logic you have A plus B are two symbols, but a flag is a symbol. Eco tried to explain that we have to give a definition of symbol which is not so widespread that we have no internal signification. I think it's interesting from my point of view because there are a lot of distinction in, for example, in glossematic schools. They say science has double articulation, form of expression and form of content. Symbol is not. Is one level, because the symbol is a fixed meaning. But you can interpret symbols, but in his own nature, symbols is different because there is just one level and not two levels. I don't agree. You can give different solutions, but it will be the subject matter of the conference.
Do we need Peirce's classification on icon signs, icon index and symbols?
Yeah, but the problem is that icon is very similarity with reality. Index is the contact with reality. They are something in common. But symbol is a cultural problem, having no relation to reality. And in my view, this three partition is not coherent, and you have probably to improve the tripartition. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I will move now to the place of semiotics in the European space. Are you optimistic about its place, and what do you think about the future of semiotics?
Oh, I think that I'm very optimistic. No, because the semiotics were very fashionable, and that is always a disaster for a discipline. Linguistics too was very fashionable. For Jacobson says linguistics is the super science of human sciences. For a long time, structuralism was identified with semiotics and so on. And after that, you have an anti-semiotic attitude. In human sciences, there is a resistance against this very simple problem, which is the interdefinition concepts. The idea that what you mean when you say sign and what you mean when you say symbols, generally people in human sciences, they don't like this kind of distinction. They say symbol or signs, symbolic dimension or semiotic dimension, well, and you say, no, what is the difference? They don't like the system of science. European culture spoke about science for centuries, millennials probably. But they speak about sign, not system of science, except in linguistics. But system of science is a very new perspective, and I think that is a very crucial question. Sometimes you can refuse that to speak. When you speak about one sign, Lotman says you speak about nothing, at least two. Yeah, this is a structural request.
But this is also the point of the French school of semiotics, to have at least two signs.
Yeah, at least that. No, it's not the problem of number of signs, a problem of relationship. And you have the relationship can be reflexive or transitive and so on. But anyway, at least two signs, at least one relation. I think that the future of semiotic is that, the idea to establish a system of science and relationship between inside system of science. Also, if you permit me, the idea that semiotics has the future possibility to use definitions of meta-definition, which are also semiotic concepts. You don't use, I don't know, now you explain all that with nature or society. You have to create a meta language which is in the same time semiotically relevant. One example for me is the problem of context. People use context for everything. When they
Define
stop,
the notion of context.
sure.
Yes.
Yeah, people use the concept of context when we have no explanation. But there is a context. Well, what is a context? For example, my coffee could be explained by the explosion creating the universe. The first moment, without this explosion, there is no coffee. But the idea, which is the relevant, the pertinent choice, permitting you to say there is a context. If you make a pertinent choice in the context, you create a co-text. Our problem is not the context, which is a very general and residual concept. In the idea, we have to create a pertinent co-text and integrate the co-text to the text you are analyzing. I use text always in this way, social text. Behavior, social codified behavior is a co-text. Manners are texts, for description, sure.
So semiotics continues to astonish. Is today appealing?
I think so. I think so, because we need simplifying. Semiotics offers an organon for human sciences. When I say organon, I said in the very old Kantian definition, opposing organon to canon. It's not canonical, no? It's not a canon you have to obey when you treat or you discuss the signification and the meaning. No, is an organon. Organon, Kant says, is a maxims of orientation. You have to prefer to use that better than this, that, and so on. But the idea that you have what we in Spanish we call una caja de herramientas, a box of instruments, you have to all the time to polish, which is in fact is interesting metalinguistic work.
Yes. Okay. Please tell me your opinion. Is semiotics a distinct philosophy, or is it a strand of hermeneutics? Where lies the difference?
Well, for me it's very clear. Start from the very important system of science, which is the language. Mm-hmm. Language is not a unique system of science, but language permits to translate system of science. Other system of science. There is a moment in which images translates language, is a writing. Chinese writing is a image strategy to represent sounds, but language is very crucial system of science. Is one among others, and probably one of the most important. There is a difference between phenomenology of language and philosophy of language. Philosophy of language and logic is an idealization of what a language is. I think that the very essence of language is not in our brain, is in the phenomenology of different languages existing in the world. Now, we have, as a linguist says, at least 5,000 or 4,000 languages in the world. And the description of languages, the good description, are made for 800, no more. We have at least 4,000 languages we don't know. We have not described enough. I think the essence of language is not in our brain. Sure, the brain processes language, it's clear. But the same brain can produce 5,000 languages, and probably during the history of man, a lot of languages are dead.
Yes, of course.
Yeah. Which is interesting for us is multiply the difference, not to reply the uniformity of language. I think that we have to study the multiplicity of languages and try to extract not the essence, but a model of language. Well, in my view, this is a phenomenological attitude. The other attitude is to say, well, in language you have subjectivity, objectivity, you have rules. There are languages in which you have subject, verb, object, other languages in which you have subject, object, verb, and so on and so on. But this is generalization we extract from the phenomenology of different languages. I think this is true for semiotics systems, for images, for example. You have not to anticipate what an image is. I said, well, wait a minute. We have millions of images, millions of systems of images, and so on. Let's see the way in which they behave and you use the practice and the meaning of different languages. I don't believe in philosophy of images. I believe in phenomenology of images.
Okay. Do you believe that biosemiotics, this new trend in semiotics, has a place in semiotic studies, or do we need to remain within its main field of research, that is the semiotics of culture, where also the Greek school belongs? For instance, I remember in Umberto, he gave an interview to Christian Bankov, and he said a lot of people came to our congresses, semiotic congresses, to see what we say. They wanted the semiotic theory, but all these scholars that came from the natural science, from sciences, where they describe me something, when they see a semiosis, I saw a reaction to the stimulus. So, in my opinion, Eco was not so optimistic about biosemiotics, but I would like to have your opinion.
Now, is a different and interesting approach. I think that biosemiotics is a coherent approach to culture. The problem is different questions. One, I take just one, the problem of the status of experiments. I believe that an experiment, a experimental space in which you produce an experiment with the correct way in which you work is true. The final result is true. What is difficult is to take the result from the experimental space and to generalize this result outside of the laboratory. Mm-hmm. The scientist knows that very well. That is uneasy to say that the result of our experimental is uneasy to export to a complex society with complex cultures. I don't know. There is also some rules of perceptions which are not exactly the same in physical context in which, for example, you have no angles, because angles is an object we construct. It's not just in reality, you know. Yes. Well, in my view, the biosemiotics perspective is another interesting way to attach the problem of meaning. But there is an under-evaluation of language in this approach. Yes. It's a new strategy. I think we have to compare the final results, but I'm not really competent in biosemiotics. Mm-hmm.
Is translation the language of Europe, as Eco suggested?
Yes. This is Eco has the gift of formula. He says, well, language of Europe, because, you know, if you go to the North and South America and you speak English and and Spanish, you have a great opportunity to be understood. In Europe, you have so different languages. And I don't know, in New Guinea, you have in a little space, you have 100 of languages. Recently in China, they discover, except from the state imposition, that there are languages we have never described. And Eco is right. You have to, in Europe, you have to make a choice of a language. Why the English? Why you use English now? A poor English, sure. I wrote in English, for example. It's very bizarre because if Brexit succeeds, yes, if the English language in Europe will be officially accepted just in Malta, the rest of Europe will not speak officially English. Well, it's a paradox. But the idea of Umberto is the appreciation he has, and I share with him, is the idea that translation is a good translation when the procedure of translation enrich the source and the target languages at the same time. You discover something. I say we don't use this word in this meaning. We have different rules of application. For example, the impersonal "ça" in French doesn't exist any. Yes. Yeah, or the zero sign of impersonal forms in Latin languages. And in other languages. We don't need in Italian or in Spanish or in Old Latin and so on. You don't need to say it rains or il pleut. You say rains, pleut. Simply. It is a zero sign. Yes. Language and not are full of zero signs in which we have positions but not filled by concrete signs. But there are a lot of positions which are empty, implied, tacit. And this makes a lot of problems for what we call the big data. Because the big data counts signs, but is very uneasy to make a count of implicit zero signs. You have to reconstruct the system to discover that we have a zero sign there and to integrate that to the data. But actually, you have not enough knowledge of the culture permitting us to reconstruct the zero signs, the tacit assumption of a language or a system of linguistic forms. Are zero signs in images? I don't know. I believe, yes, it is. But how you can explain, how can discover? And if you make a count of empirical signs, you have a very interesting result. But you forget a lot to what is tacit, what is implicit, what is sottovalutato, underdeveloped, and so on. Tacit knowledge. It's very difficult to calculate the tacit knowledge. You have to reconstruct before.
In his book, Experiences in Translation, Eco seems to disagree with you, with your stance, that translation is interpretation, arguing that first we interpret and then we translate. Do you insist on your position? Because for a great number of scholars in translation studies, they agree that first we interpret and then we translate. But I was very pleased to see your position, because there is also an important number of translation scholars that they start saying that translation is interpretation.
Well, first, I disagree with Eco with other questions, not exactly on that. The disagreement about Eco was about the possibility of translations from linguistics to other systems of science. Eco doesn't believe in transduction. I don't understand, because, for example, Roman Jakobson wrote a marvelous article in Linguistic Inquiry. The first
aspects of translation.
Yes, no, but the verbal art of poet painters is a marvelous article in which he says that it's very possible. He quotes Rousseau, Les Douaniers, Blake, and so on, Paul Klee, and he says, well, there is a possibility of homology between system of representation, textual representation, linguistic representation, for example, a poem, and in the same time an image. And there are poets and painters, they do that, simply, and they assume they do. De Chirico in Italy made exactly the same things. For me, is it possible, with careful way, to show that it's possible a translation from language, and not the language in general, the specific organization of language to a specific organization of images. I believe in this kind of transduction. Eco doesn't believe in it. Eco, all the book of Eco is about linguistic translation. Yeah. Well, this is the real disagreement. The other one is the problem of interpretation. Let me say something very, let me use the very simple definition. I have to go to the Aristotelian, and I have the problem to go to the red building. I take my, my little dictionary and I say, Kokino Kyrion. There is no interpretation. There is Kokino is red, Kyrion is a building. They don't need interpretation, sorry. It depends the size of the text. There are simple signs have a common content and different system of expression. Well, with different expression, you can transmit the same content, but with the same expression, you can describe different content. Well, I think this problem of interpretation is on another level of language, which is the level asking for interpretation. I know that if you have to translate complex system of languages, the interpretation is very important. Look at the problem of metaphors. Well, if you translate literally a metaphor, is absurd. You have to know that is oblique way of speaking. In this case, you say you have to interpret that not as a literal, but as a non-literal. In this case, interpretation is necessary. Yeah, but it depends from the level, you know. The level of languages, the level of images, this is the question. I will give you an example very well known in history of art. The history of art knows that in the 15th centuries, a man as Leon Battista Alberti says that when you paint something, and he knows what he has to say, when you paint something, you paint a story, a narrative, you have actors, actions, and narration. Well, not only that, but also sometimes you may introduce in the story an actor pointing to the story itself and looking to the viewer and saying, this is the very important things. For example, Paul of Tarsus, Saint Paul, Agios Pavlos. Agios Pavlos. There's a moment in which he is very close to his horse because he falls from the horse. And there is a beautiful horse, and the man, Agios Pavlos, is very little in the very last part of the paintings. But there is a man, a commentator, pointing by the finger or by the spear, and so pointing to him as an instruction to the viewer that there is something you have to look. Yeah, this is a strategy of interaction you use in language and you use in images. And this is a crucial, interesting idea, but it doesn't explain all the specificity of the paintings. But it's a common organization in our culture in which you translate the idea of a narrative and the idea of what we call enunciation, the way in which you point on the text some meaning, you can focalization of meaning. Well, I think that is very, it's very possible to make this kind of things. This, what I call transduction, is not the idea that you have to project the linguistic models to the images. It's to show that there is a common ground in which systems of semantic system can be represented by linguistic and visual strategies.
But you use the notion, you propose the notion of transduction.
Yeah.
Why you don't adopt the notion of intersemiotic translation as proposed by Jakobson?
No, I said, well, translation and transduction. Well, if you don't like it, we will come back to Jakobson.
No, I don't. No, it's not that. But sometimes we combine new terms with another field of research. For instance, some scholars said perhaps Fabbri or other scholars propose the notion of transduction because we start now speak about anti-iconicity. And I don't know if this thought is your thought also.
Yeah, iconicity seems to me very banal. You have two images and to say it's inter-iconicity. It's very banal. The idea of a transduction implies that there are rules. Are they rules of transduction of inter-iconicity? To say that you have inter-iconicity, if you try to explain that you have two images and you have to make the images in relationship, is banal. You have to, as people say, we have a face-to-face interaction. Mm-hmm. And in this case, you look at the face of the other and the other look in your face. Mm-hmm. Is it a concept?
But there is a structure, a transported structure. Not only intertextuality, but we translate, we make a transposition on the informational load. Yeah.
If the idea of intertextuality is a simple idea that there are many texts with different with different substance of expression, is really banal. Sure, you have writing and an image, you know. No, but the idea of intertextuality is asked for more than that. The idea, how are the rules permitting you to integrate or opposing or integration of substitution of this kind of data organization. In this case, I prefer to speak about transduction because transduction implies we have to discover rules of transformation of one to the other. The idea of intertextuality has this kind of force of pointing to a problem, not to say that if you open a newspaper, you can find an intertextuality because there is a picture and there is a text. But this is not. Is exactly as when you say that rain comes from the high to the earth. Well, yes, the problem is gravity. force of gravity. Yeah.
Yes, I understand. Do you agree that there are different degrees of intersemiotic translation? Is the information law a criterion to establish a typology of intersemiotic translation? And if not, what is?
I know that we have, in the same time, to use the knowledge we have in different disciplines and to organize this knowledge in different ways. For example, we spent almost too much time trying to have a look on images, because now images are so pervasive, so generalized, that you are obliged to take in account that you live in a world of ghosts. But there are more interesting things. For example, music. Music takes a really crucial problem for semiotics. But, for example, and the logic take very seriously the problem of distinction of words, distinction of difference of rules, grammatical rules, and so on. But, for example, we have not a good knowledge of the continuous dimension, because you put too much, in a structural point of view, the attention to the to the opposition, to the distinction, to the differences. But there is in language, there is a musical problem, which is the prosodic forms. And prosodic forms are continuous, and you have stress, accent, making differentiation. But are really continuous dimension is really a musical problem. I think that is very interesting for us, because the prosodic dimension is the dimension of emotion, for example. It's difficult to describe an emotion just by distinctive words. Sometimes it's just the intonation. But the force of discourse, in oral discourse, the force are described by intonation. Imperative force, interrogative force are described by intonation. I think, for example, that music helps to think that there is a musical dimension in language, and musical dimension of language is responsible for the force and for the emotions. But what you can say about music is very difficult to say. I have friends of mine working on music and semiotic of music. I ask them if they have a strong definition, minimal definition, in which we agree, because we spent our time that music as a signifier without signified. Right. Well, my answer is the same as Derrida. Derrida said, if there is no signified, why you use the term signifier? Signifier means that there is a signified. If there is no signified, don't use the term signified. Such a thing as a signifier without signified means nothing. What is the music? I said, well, is the introduction of human relationship in the substance of the word. The sound substance of the word is invested by human relationship, and I say human relationship are too much. But I don't know, I think that it's possible to discover homology, very strong homology between poetic forms and musical forms. It's very possible. And the idea of narrative could be also a possibility to show that there is a narrative forms in music, or I don't know, the poetic organization in music and in language, and also in images. But it's a subject matter of research. sometimes people working in music, they have interesting hypotheses. Yes. For example, taking another example, Mayor Shapiro, looking to some mimetic images, and he says, well, you have a frontal image and the profile image. And he says, well, it's possible to say that it's possible to translate these two positions in pronominal forms. Frontal is I, you, and profile is he or it. Well, I don't believe that is a strong morphological relationship between pronouns in language and frontal and profile position in mimetic images. But what he said is into the intuitive forms, to say that there is a deictic relationship. Deictic is indication and so on. Deictic space in which you can express the deictic relationship with images, with certain kind of treatment of images, and certain kind of organization of pronouns. Pronouns in the sense of personal pronouns, temporal pronouns, spatial pronouns, and so on. The question is not to translate pronouns to images. No, it's the idea that to discover that there is an homology. And the intuition of this intuition is very important for us for transforming the intuition in a more systematic way. Is the distinction the Grammas used to say, different disciplines give a very interesting connotative descriptions. We have to take these connotations and translate this connotation in a more general metalinguistic and coherent level. But we have to know the meaning connotations in different kind of systems.
Of course, because culture resists in translation, it resists in connotations.
Absolutely.
It's a cultural construction, so it's very difficult to translate connotations.
Yeah,
you are right.
It's very, very difficult. But in the same time, the idea of connotation is one term also that we have to take in account. Barth, in SZ, wrote something which is really anti-structuralist. The idea that connotation is a sort of golden power on the text. Disseminates, the idea of dissemination and so on and so on. In my view, it depends from the intelligence of the analyst, the sensibility and the knowledge and the competence. I don't agree completely. I think that there is a structure of structural connotations. I will give you an example. There are people that speak in a certain way or behave in a certain way. You can say it's vulgar, or you say it's elegant. Yes. But you have two categories, vulgar and elegant. There are social connotations, but social connotation can be opposed to each other. In my view, you can give a structural definition of a social connotation. For example, kitsch, the aesthetic dimension of kitsch. Kitsch is very bizarre because it is possibly out of the ugly and the beautiful is a strange aesthetic idea that sometimes something is at the same time vulgar and elegant and so on, beautiful and disgusting, But there are concepts, there are categories, and you have to say, sometimes you can split, sometimes you can put together. There are confused moments, it's necessary to refuse the kitsch or to like the kitsch, I think it's very possible to give a structured definition of connotations.
Do you like Barth's definition that connotation is a voluntary noise?
Yeah, but it's a metaphor. We have to transform in a theoretical concept.
Okay. And For a certain number of scholars, Eco was the last of a generation of scholars of semiotics. Taking into consideration your personal relation with him, do you share this view? Is there a significant role to be played in public discourse for new scholars of semiotics?
I think so. In my view, people now doesn't like this point of view, but I think that the very beginning of semiotics in Russia and in Europe was the political discussion of the regime. In Russia, the imposition, communist imposition of dialectical heritage of Marxism, which was a sort of a queen or I don't know, or king of human sciences, found the opposition in the formalist analysis, in the attempt to analyze in a different way the language and so on, is not a bizarre idea that Lotman was not in Moscow; he was in the marginal part of Russia. But it was the same in Europe. The idea of Barth is to use semiotics as a way to not to destroy, but to discuss formally the ideology of bourgeoisie, which is this period, the moment in which Barth was very Brechtian orientation. He was interested in theater and he was a Brechtian. And I think that semiotics has a tradition, formal studies, a tradition of political engagement. I think is very useful without utopian dreams. The idea of human sciences to be critical sciences of society organization. I wrote something about zombies because I think that zombie is not just a monster, is a good representation of social contradiction today.
Thank you very much for this interview, and I hope to see you again in Greece.
I hope so.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you.